Chapter 29. I was finally getting a good understanding of how Dinah's trap actually worked. I could read all I wanted from the Carousel Atlas, but it wasn't until I started this storyline that it really came together and formed a complete picture in my mind. We were cut off from the story. Sure, we were there, and it was possible that some little indication of our existence might end up in the final film, but we were not really characters. We were warm bodies that happened to be in the same vicinity of the story, and I was clueless as to how we were going to fix that without causing bigger problems. I had some idea of how to direct the action of a storyline when I was a character in one, and even though I was usually a secondary character, or at least I started as one, that was worlds apart from what I was here, a nameless voice over an intercom. I had to imagine that the isolated nature of the storyline played into how Dinah's rescue manifested. I could see that Dr. Andrew Hughes, or at least the NPC playing him, as well as Michael Brooks and Lila White, were on screen most of the time. That was a problem. As NPCs, they didn't need off-screen breaks. This storyline could end up being very quick. Even when we spoke to them, and they went off-screen to respond, they didn't stay off-screen long. How were we supposed to make our presence known enough that we could affect the final film? Could we really pull this off from the shadows? I didn't know. Lila White was a wallflower, and the NPC playing her was living up to that name. Even as Michael and Andrew discussed what they were going to do, she stayed in the back with her arms crossed, looking nervous and disgusted by the bugs around her. She was small and pale and might have made a good hysteric. I couldn't blame her for that part. I was so glad we didn't run this storyline as prep. I couldn't imagine being in a situation like that myself. There was no way to kill the enemy. They were surrounded, and from the look of the bedbug tropes, I had the feeling the bedbugs were just not going to go away. They had a plot armor of 100. Could an enemy like that be defeated in a traditional way? Would it be a waste of time to try? Can you please open the door? Andrew Hughes asked, trying not to allow his emotion to reach his voice but failing. I'm sorry, Ibex said, but I need an officer's approval to allow you out of this room. None of the officers can awaken. Don't you understand? They are being sedated right now for their own health. Isn't there some protocol for this situation? Andrew asked. While Carousel leads several industries in preparedness and innovation, it is not guaranteed that every situation will be accounted for. This is why it's imperative to rely on our trained officers and business managers. But they're all sedated. Andrew said. Yes, Ibex said, I am unable to circumvent my protocols on this matter. Let me check to see if I have any wiggle room. Nope. I have sent a message to Carousel headquarters with a comprehensive explanation of the problem and expect to hear a response within 3 months. 3 months. Michael screamed. Are you kidding me? We're going to be dead in 3 months. There's no food. That is incorrect, Ibex said. I am stocked with plenty of nutrition for the whole crew. We even have a live protein incubator on this ship. What did live protein incubator mean exactly? But we can't get to it unless you let us out of this room, Michael said. Ibex must have been stumped there because it didn't answer. I didn't know what to do to help with the situation. But one thing that made sense to me was that I had to talk to Ibex and try to understand how it worked. I couldn't tell if it was just a series of pre-recorded messages combined with a bit of old-school tech know-how or if it was genuine artificial intelligence by sci-fi standards. I sat down in one of the chairs on the flight deck and opened a chat with Ibex. It was easy because all I had to do was think about it and press a button. And unless I just happened to press the right button, it would seem that Carousel didn't care about the specifics. It was make-believe. Ibex, do you know what's going on? I asked. It would appear that most of the employees and private contractors I am carrying have not awoken from their deep sleep chambers due to negative readings on their health monitors, Ibex answered. He was talking to me and to the NPCs at the same time, 2 different conversations. What is causing the health issue? I asked as the others gathered around me. While your concern for the private contractors and officers aboard my sleeping bays is laudable, I cannot disclose medical information that is deemed private. I hope you understand, Ibex said. I was prepared for evil artificial intelligence gone rogue, but ultra-bureaucratic artificial intelligence was proving to be far more frustrating. There's something on the floor and covering the sleeping bay. Can you tell me what I am seeing? I asked. I could see up on the monitor as the camera zoomed in close enough to make out the individual wriggling bed bugs marching to and fro. It would appear that... He paused. Excuse me. I have gathered the information that you require, Ibex said, and I will make sure that Captain Marlin is apprised of it immediately. There was something strange in his automated voice, almost like a disc skipping, as if he wanted to say something but immediately changed his direction. The image on the screen right now, Kimberly said, having found a tie to put her hair up in a ponytail. What is on that image? Just answer that. Those are bed bugs, I believe, Ibex said. So you're infested with bed bugs, right? Kimberly asked. No, Ibex said. The pre-launch procedures designed by Carousel have been tested as being 100% effective at preventing contamination and infestation of all foreign life forms. We looked at each other in frustration. But the image on the screen showing the interior of the sleeping bay shows bed bugs. Ant-Man asked. Yes, the image is of bed bugs, Ibex responded. We looked at each other. It's like he has some kind of mental block, Cassie said. He can't acknowledge what's going on. That made me think of something. When you said you sent a message to headquarters, did you mention the bed bugs? I asked. Ibex took a while to answer, but then he said, it is unclear whether you are permitted to know the contents of a message sent to headquarters. I thought for a moment. Maybe you should send a similar message to nearby ships in case there are any qualified officers on board who may be able to relay your message more efficiently, I suggested. Does your protocol forbid that? For a few moments, Ibex did not say anything. My protocol does not directly forbid that. I have sent a Mayday beacon with a similar message encoded, Ibex said. I looked over at Rudy, the captain of the Helios. Did we get that Mayday? Rudy looked at the screen and said, yes, we did. He clicked something, and an indicator appeared on his screen. Open the message, Rudy said. The Helios AI voice responded, this message is for officers ranked A3 or above. I am the captain of this ship, Rudy said. You will open that message. That's an order. At that, it appeared that the message was opened. Rudy read through it. No, he didn't mention bed bugs, Rudy said. He just said it was some sort of mysterious malfunction or health problem. That wasn't useful to us directly, except it did give us insight into Ibex's thinking. Okay, I said. So the first thing we know is that it cares about corporate hierarchy to the letter, but not necessarily the spirit of the rules. It could send a message for a high-ranked officer to this ship, and then the captain of this ship could order his ship to read the message, but he couldn't just directly tell us what was in the message. Sounds like wonderful design, Isaac said. What it sounds like, Ant-Man said, is that they put all of their effort into advancing technology and nothing into stopping hackers. Well, that would be the 1980s sci-fi movies for you, I said. It almost sounds like it just can't admit there are bed bugs, Ramona said. So that's probably why it didn't do anything about it. I didn't know if the programming was that simple. Surely, he wasn't restricted from fixing problems just because he wasn't allowed to admit to them. That would be ridiculous. Ibex, I said, what is the procedure for when bed bugs are found aboard the ship in flight? When a commanding officer is made aware of any infestation, such as bed bugs, they will first coordinate with me to develop a plan for addressing the particular needs brought up by the issue. For bed bugs, there are no insecticides aboard the ship, but there are both chemical and alternative methods for dispatching such an infestation. Wait, I said, so your only protocol for dealing with bedbugs assumes that a human officer sees them first. Carousel pre-launch procedures have 100% effectiveness at preventing emergencies like a bedbug infestation. I started to respond, but Antoine jumped in. Wait a minute, he said. Can you say something negative about Carousel for me? Just give me any criticism of the company. Carousel is an exemplary organization, Ibex said. While year after year of increased profits and market performance are not absolute indicators of corporate health, they do suggest a general trend that Carousel is a rapidly advancing and evolving company. That's not what I asked, Ant-Man said. Can you see any news articles about Carousel that are not flattering? Do you have that kind of information? Alas, Ibex said, corporate sabotage and smear campaigns have touched many great companies, including Carousel. No meaningful accusations of malfeasance have ever been substantiated. Ant-Man looked back at us. It can't disparage its company, he said. It literally cannot say something negative or even seem to imply it. Somehow, the pre-launch procedures didn't work, but it won't acknowledge that because it has to pretend those procedures are 100% effective. It's practically blind to the bed bugs. That made sense when it came to actually talking to Ibex, but I had to wonder how deeply that behavior was coded. Was it not able to acknowledge problems that it was told could not exist or that would harm Carousel if discussed? That didn't feel like a complete picture. There was a symphony of errors on that ship. The question was, which errors could we fix? Bedbugs had a long tradition of hurting corporate pocketbooks in the hospitality industry. It would make sense if they had a similar effect on stock prices in a world where people were shipped off into space. We continued to fiddle with Ibex more, trying to understand precisely how he thought and how he reacted. Meanwhile, NPCs Andrew, Michael, and Lila were busy trying their own efforts to get out of the large warehouse that comprised the sleeping bay of the ship. I hadn't been watching them very closely because it didn't seem like they were having much success. Based on the gimmick of Dinah's rescue trop, it seemed likely that they could never succeed on their own. The question was, how could we intervene? The answer was not a happy one. The party phase continued to fly by regardless of what we did or said because the story wasn't about us. It was about the psychological horror that the three NPC surrogates were experiencing. Most psychological horror of this ilk did not rely on plot beats based on an antagonist's actions but rather on how a situation affected the emotional well-being of its principal characters. Based on that alone, the story flew by, and I was nothing but a fly on the wall watching it. These NPCs were suffering as the bugs crawled all over. They spasmed and itched and were visibly miserable and jumpy. I watched them through the monitors, which were kindly giving us a live feed of the surrogates. I don't understand how bed bugs would have gotten on the ship to begin with, Andrew Hughes said. The protocols that they had in place were nauseating and repetitious. I don't understand how anything could have gotten on here. They practically scalded our skin off. I'm not surprised at all, Michael said. That was all for show, the procedures. They were trying to prove to us who's boss and how unimportant we were, treating us like cattle being doused in disinfectant. We should never have come here, Lila said. All those people picketing because of safety concerns, why did we not listen? Don't go talking like that, Michael said. We came here for a job, for honest labor. We have nothing to be ashamed of. If those people wanted to work, they would have. The question is, how did bedbugs get here? That's not the question, Andrew said as he paced around to make sure the bugs didn't crawl on him. That question doesn't give us any answers that can help. The question is, how do we get out of this room and get to safety? The longer we wait, the more dire the situation becomes. Spaceships, even with AI, cannot sail indefinitely without human intervention. That is by design. You know what I mean, Michael said. I do, and I think that whatever the answer is, we'll never find it. The protocols that they designed were tested against control groups and volunteers. I've been thinking a lot about this, the methodology they would have used. I doubt they tested it against people who had some motive to sneak in a child's stuffed teddy bear or their lover's perfumed coat to keep them warm at night while we're gone in space for nearly 10 years. Carousel's methods were not tested against people who might have a motive to subvert them. And I hate to break this to you, but all the people in these pods, aside from the officers, were not exactly well trained. They didn't understand why we weren't allowed to bring anything from home. All they understood was that they shouldn't get caught. Most of the people in this room had never even been to space before. They weren't ready, they weren't cautious, They didn't know the risks or care. They wanted money. We cast our lot in with rats, and we wonder why we got fleas, or in this case, bed bugs. Oh, because you're so much better than the rest of us, Michael said. You're above it all. I didn't say that, Andrew replied. You think I'd be on this ship if I still had my medical license? No, I'm no better than the rest of them, but I know that I'm not the reason that bedbugs got brought onto this human buffet. I followed the rules. I've been to space before, Michael said. It was a ground conflict in the Martian colonies. A bad case of lice went through my unit. We were all shaved slick as dolphins. Thought that'd be the worst of it. He scratched at his face until blood drenched his fingers. Just watching them itching themselves, wriggling, trying to get some form of relief that never came, I couldn't help but scratch myself. I also vowed that if I ever had the opportunity to give my character a background of fighting in a Martian war, I was going to do it. So, what are we going to do? Michael said. We're gonna try and break the door. No, my friend, Andrew said. You're being far too literal. We're just going to break the glass. I didn't know what he meant until I watched through one of the camera feeds as he pried open a metal panel on the side of the wall and unveiled a small bright red handle behind a glass pane with a sign above it that read fire alarm. Break the glass, indeed. I almost asked Ebex what the procedure was for when someone pulls a fire alarm, but I didn't because I oddly felt like I would be ratting on the NPCs. So, instead, I asked Rudy, the captain of our ship. It's not a bad idea, Rudy said. Fire suppression is critical in a spaceship, as you might imagine. The first thing that will happen is that oxygen will get sucked out of that room, not all of it. It won't be a vacuum, but enough that the fire won't spread. Then CO2 will get pumped in, assuming they have enough of it in storage. It might be nitrogen. I'm not sure how the sedated passengers will factor in. It's hard to tell with old ships like that, especially a modular build like that. We don't know what the procedure is. It might help. It might do nothing. Andrew looked at the others and said, I think you should go into your chambers. We don't know what's going to happen. Michael looked at him and said, I'm not going anywhere. Pull the lever. Lila went into the sleeping chamber and quickly pulled the top up, but based on the lights on the side, it never clicked on. Andrew lifted the glass protective plate and pulled the lever. And nothing happened. What the hell? Andrew said. He pulled the handle a few more times. What's going on, Ebex? He asked. You are not authorized to trigger the alarm. Only Carousel employees have access to that function unless I am able to verify the existence of a fire independently. Andrew dropped to the ground, straight to his knees. Andrew, Michael, and all of the other non-officers on the ship were private contractors, not employees. On some level, it made sense that a spaceship would not just let anyone trigger a fire suppression system. Can we still talk to them? Ant-Man asked. I think so, I said, but I'm not sure if we should when they're on screen. We need to start telling them what to do, then, Ant-Man said. We're almost out of the party phase, and we need to take charge here. Why aren't they doing the obvious thing? Why don't they drag an officer out of his pod and put his eye up against the scanner or something? Isaac asked. There was no eye scanner, but his point wasn't bad. Players would do that, I said, but they're not players. We need to direct them to do things. I say we do that, Isaac said. Couldn't hurt, Ant-Man added. Undoubtedly, the first thing players would attempt would be to wake up an officer. Of course, because it was the first thing people would think to do, I doubted it would work. Still, we had to play the game. So we waited a few moments, long enough for Carousel to get all the shots they needed of the surrogate's depressed reaction to the failed fire alarm stunt. As soon as they went off-screen, Ant-Man walked up to the console with the red button, pressed it, and said, You have to wake up one of the officers. Andrew heard him and asked, Who is this? Do you have any way of getting the ship to let us out of this room? Do what I said, Ant-Man said. You have to wake up one of the officers. I don't know how, Andrew admitted. Even if we manage to get a chamber open, that doesn't automatically wake up the person that's in it, and we might be seen as hostile by Ibex itself for damaging property. And one almost responded again, but then, remembering our team strategies, he gestured for Isaac to speak. Maybe being seen as hostile isn't the worst thing, Isaac said. It might be what it takes to open the door. Andrew's eyes perked up. I could see them even though he wasn't very large on the screen. The realization that he might have to poke the bear seemed to have registered with him. Wait, Isaac said. No, don't do that. Oh, shit. Bad idea? I asked. He nodded his head. Not the worst. But not great. Isaac had hindsight 20/20 equipped. He could tell his action was not the best one. But it was too late. Michael had found some piece of pipe lying around the room, and before we could say anything, he was back on screen, smashing the pipe into one of the deep sleep chambers. It only took a moment for us to realize why that might not have been the best decision. However, I was sure Carousel loved it because the ensuing chaos probably provided some terrifying footage. As soon as Michael started attacking the chambers, an emergency protocol was initiated, causing red lights to start blaring around the area where he was smashing things, not just the red lights on the chambers themselves, the room lights. And then the chambers near the incident started to open. Ramona, get Cassie out of here. I said immediately, as soon as I realized what was about to happen. I didn't know if Ramona understood why, but she grabbed Cassie and dragged her down the platform and away from the side of the monitor. Cassie had a trap that allowed her to share pain with others, and she had a bad habit of triggering it unintentionally, or at least without good forethought. I didn't know if that would happen this time, but I did know that there was undoubtedly about to be a lot of anguish in front of us. It only took a few moments for the screams to start. But they weren't huge, breathy screams. No, they were choked, miserable screams accompanied by gurgling and coughing. Then, we saw on the screen just how terrible a little bug can be. How would bed bugs do all this? Isaac asked, suddenly taking things far more seriously than I had ever seen him. Because on the screen, arms started to rise out of their chambers, bloody, pulpy messes covered in scabs and bleeding wounds that oozed with pus. These people weren't just covered in scabs, though. Many of them were swollen and misshapen, which didn't make sense to me because I had never associated that kind of injury with bedbugs before. But then, there had probably never been, in the history of our planet, a more severe situation involving bedbugs. Stop it. Andrew said. It's triggering all of the chambers to open. We have to sedate them again. But I thought that once they were woken up, they wouldn't be able to go back in, Michael said in horror. Not for more than a few hours unless we can get an officer to, he stopped explaining as his eyes darted around the room. Some of the afflicted were already trying to stumble to their feet. Others never actually left their chambers. They couldn't. Andrew immediately began examining some of the injured miners. But oh no. Anemia, infection, allergic reactions, he said. They were sensitized to the proteins in the bedbug's saliva and became allergic. We have to get them hooked back up to their chambers now. They need to be on life support. As if to punctuate his demand, some of the awakened began seizing, flailing, and if I wasn't mistaken, going into cardiac arrest. He and Michael began hauling people back to their chambers, though that wasn't particularly difficult as most of them didn't manage to make it far. What's wrong with that one? Michael asked, looking at something we couldn't see. The person was still inside their chamber. They succumbed to infection, Andrew answered. Michael gave another glance back down. We watched in horror as they worked to help return every miner in the vicinity to their chambers. Luckily, only those near where Michael was breaking things actually woke up. The others were still sedated. All told, there were probably 16 miners ejected from their chambers, but their raspy screams filled the room. It must have smelled bad because Michael would gag on occasion. Why did we do that? He asked. Why did I do that? I'm sorry. I'm so fucking stupid. Hey now. Luckily, even though Isaac's suggestion that they act hostile had triggered the mass ejection, causing untold suffering to all those who were broken out of sedation, It did bear fruit. Several of those who were woken up were officers working for Carousel. "Pick one, anyone," Michael said as they surveyed the 3 officers who had been woken from their chambers. The officers were completely out of it, and while one of them tried to say something unsuccessfully, the other 2 were still under the effects of sedation or infection or allergic reaction or something. They were scabbed over skeletons cursed with life. They had them leaned up against one of the chambers. It was neat that one little suggestion from Isaac, perhaps a little bit too zealous, had set forth an entirely new stream of story. Perhaps it was a brutal version, but it was interesting nonetheless. With one little nudge, we could change the direction of the narrative, and the NPCs would go along with it because they were scripted to follow our lead. At least, they followed our instructions for things like this. "Martinez is the healthiest at first glance," Andrew said, "but he's also the lowest ranked. He was the only one of them who seemed to have a normal-shaped face. The others had strange growths like their skin had gotten thick or swollen to look like elephant skin covered in scabs. All I care is that he's high enough rank to get us out of this room," Michael said. Andrew nodded. He walked up closer to the character who had the name Martinez on his jumpsuit, or whatever it was, and examined him. "Officer Martinez, this is Dr. Andrew Hughes. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Officer Martinez did not respond. "He has to be able to talk, right?" Michael asked. "To open the door." "I think so," Andrew said. "I'm thinking this is the result of prolonged infection as a result of bites and then agitation from the deep sleep chamber as it stimulated his muscles and his blood ran through his slicker. He's not catatonic, he climbed out of his chamber. But he isn't responding. Curious. Yeah, that's great. Are the other ones alive? Are they brain dead too?" Andrew examined Martinez a little further but then moved on to the next one and then the next one. "Officer Emhoff," Andrew asked the man who was mumbling to himself, "do you understand me?" Emhoff suddenly snapped out of his stupor, if only enough to make eye contact with Dr. Hughes. He swallowed and wriggled his lips as if he was trying to wet his parched mouth. "Help," the man rasped. "I'm going to help you," Dr. Hughes said. "I just need you to tell the computer to open the door to this room." "Help," Emhoff repeated. "Does he understand what's going on?" Michael asked. I noticed that Lila had finally found her way out of her chamber, having missed the terrifying part intentionally. Andrew had a resigned look on his face. An idea struck me. "Ibex, do you see those crew members trying to open the door to the sleeping bay?" "Yes, they are not authorized," Ibex responded. "Did you not hear the command from Officer Emhoff to help them?" "I did not register that as a command to assist in opening the door," Ibex responded. So he wasn't that stupid, but there was still hope. "That's incorrect," I said. "Listen again." As if scripted to do so, Dr. Hughes said again, "I need you to tell the computer to open the door to this room." And as he had been repeating, Officer Emhoff whispered in a husky tone, "Help." "See?" I said. "He's telling you to help them." I was betting that a computer wouldn't be able to pick up on social cues and understand what was going on but would take the literal meaning of the words being spoken. To my most incredible thrill, my little trick worked because moments later, the door to the large room containing all of the deep sleep chambers popped open with a release of steam and slid out of the way. Afterward, Officer Emhoff leaned over and either passed out or died. Either way, they loaded the officers back in their sleep chambers for life support. We were learning. Now, what was next? Chapter 30 time was different between our two ships. This became abundantly clear, and the reason was simple. Our ship had conscious players in it. The other ship, filled with bed bugs and doomed passengers, wasn't exactly speeding up or anything like that. I didn't see them zooming around on the camera. Instead, I could see that all of the NPCs, the conscious ones, at least, were going from mark to mark and shooting footage for Carousel. As they did, the timestamp on the footage would jump forward days at a time. It was probably a lot easier for Carousel when all of the characters in the movie were scripted. This spelled trouble for me because I really wanted my dailies drop to activate, which would allow me to see uncut footage from the day before, But because I wasn't experiencing day and night cycles, the dailies didn't come. Luckily, there was something we could do about that. I don't know exactly how this works, Ant-Man said. There's not, like, a button in my mind or anything. He cleared his throat and then continued, nighttime. He smacked his hands together. It is now nighttime. We waited for a moment. Sure enough, all of the NPCs on our ship, the Helio, started to shift around as Rudy and Flannery went off to the sleeping room, and some of the others took the helm. As they did, the dailies appeared in my mind on the red wallpaper. Ant-Man's in bed by 9 trop allowed him to trigger a sort of narrative bedtime that made a lot more sense when you were on Earth, or at least whatever Carousel was. We weren't spinning on an axis near a star, so nighttime didn't make as much sense. His ability didn't just affect us. No, the time fast-forwarding on the other ships stopped immediately, and the player surrogates started getting ready to try and find a place to sleep, which was something we had not yet seen them do, and for good reason. It was traumatic. They didn't get much sleep. Their entire ship was infested with bed bugs, and although they had managed to make it out of the sleeping bay, the rest of the ship they had access to a large hall, some closets, and a poorly stocked kitchenette was not much more hospitable. How are they everywhere? Lila, the wallflower surrogate, complained as she itched herself into a raw, pulpy mess. Michael, who was pretending to be a soldier archetype, was very angry and losing his self-control. He would bang his fists on doors and scream in frustration as he realized that every single room they went to seemed to be infested. Why would they be in here? This is a closet. He screamed as he knocked down a shelf that held random supplies like flashlights and lanyards. Andrew, the doctor surrogate, was much calmer. That's not to say he was relaxed, but compared to the other two, he was taking things in stride. I told you time and time again, bed bugs can traverse a house easily in chase of prey. And if I'm not mistaken, the Ibex systems are unintentionally spreading them. There's an attachment that comes out on a large arm that vacuums the floor. I have to wonder if that very attachment is actually spreading them around the ship. I'm gonna kill somebody, Michael said. If we have to stay in these conditions for much longer, I hope that somebody is me, Andrew said. _. Watching them was like watching the animatronics on a dark ride. They had fully fledged conversations with each other, and they were some of the most in-depth NPCs I had ever seen. They felt real. Usually, to get that kind of detail, a player had to be involved, activating the dialogue cues to get the proper backstory. I almost felt as if Carousel was using them to show us what it wanted, repeating the same topics over and over again with a slightly different delivery, giving out bits of personality here and there so that Carousel could pick and choose to construct a character arcade. It left me wondering if there was a lot more flexibility to being on screen than I initially believed. Of course, I wasn't ready to experiment with those theories just yet. I had yet to be on screen for the entire film. It wasn't too long after Antoine created a nighttime break for the story that Cassie and Ramona started calling our names. I hadn't seen them since we sent them away hours earlier to prevent Cassie from accidentally activating her anguish trop. They were in the sleeping bay of our ship, and as we rushed through the door, I saw that Ramona, Cassie, Isaac, and Dinah were all at the back of the room near the strange machine called the Formather. While it had remained dormant for most of the time we had been there, it was now beeping to life. Some of its eggshell white parts had moved around and shifted to make the machine larger, while others lit up with light to create a screen. "What's going on in here?" Ant-Man asked. "Who touched it?" "I didn't touch it," Cassie said. "I just thought about it." "What?" he asked. "I just thought about it, and it started turning on," Cassie explained. As we approached, I saw a red light on the screen, along with many symbols I didn't understand and the words "Please enter genetic sample" in bright orange letters. Cassie had said that her thoughts had activated it as if she could control it with her mind. In some ways, that made sense because there were no buttons to press, so there had to be some way to control it. The truth became clear moments later. While we weren't exactly enthusiastic about messing with the machine, it was interesting, and we had to believe that Carousel had put it there for some reason, even if the reason was mundane. So we started out with just a quick tap on the screen that did nothing. Oddly, despite the futuristic design, it didn't even have a touch screen. Then, we tried more academic measures, such as whacking the side of the machine in hopes that it would do something. I'm not sure this is a good idea. I thought I asked you to take away the fuse or whatever it was so it wouldn't power on, I said to Dinah. I did. The NPCs replaced it, she responded. Cassie had developed a very strong interest in it, and to be frank, so did I as I stared at it. It didn't take long for me to realize the machine was whispering to us. I didn't even notice it was happening until I tried to listen to the others talking and realized I could barely hear them over the strange static the machine was putting out. Cassie and I were the only ones to hear it. When I covered my ears and asked people to stop talking, they were confused. It wants me to put my hand in it, Cassie said. She was right. The whispers, whatever they were, definitely wanted us to interact with it, not in a strange compulsive way, but more in an instruction manual type of way. It was telling us how to operate it. I was so curious that I didn't even stop Cassie when she stuck her hand inside a small opening in the machine. She jerked her hand back out. It poked me, she said. As soon as she had withdrawn her hand, the opening in the machine closed up seamlessly. It was once again the white eggshell of all the other machines on the ship, other than the deep sleep pods. The machine hummed and weird, and warmer seemed to exude from it, though I couldn't see any vents. Moments later, a picture of Cassie appeared on the screen, except this Cassie didn't have pierced ears or tattoos, and she certainly didn't have colored streaks in her hair. It was like a picture created from memory, a police sketch of a fever dream. The readout stated, "Subject analysis complete. Neurocognitive augmentation markers detected and verified. Genetic profile indicates advanced neural capabilities exceeding standard parameters. Proceed with further augmentation or psychic testing protocols as required." "Where's the copy button?" Isaac asked. "What? What is it saying?" Kimberly asked, ignoring Isaac. I started to laugh because I finally figured out one of the crucial questions we had been asking. Why was it that Cassie's psychic drop did not work on the base storyline, but it did work whenever Dinah's rescue drop was brought into the mix? This was the reason. This funny machine from the future told us everything we needed to know. "There are psychics in the world of the story where this ship is from," I said, "but there are no psychics in the world of the story where that itch is from. The Ibex doesn't have psychics. This ship does not exist in the base story because it's from somewhere else." Carousel had used pieces of one story to help create the rescue conditions for another. The reason that Cassie and I could hear something coming from the machine was because we had psychic powers from her archetype and my background trop, and it was clear that whatever happened in the storyline the Helio was from, psychic powers were common enough that they operated machines. In fact, I was almost sure that this ship must literally be an alien craft. Nothing about the Helio required that it be a human vessel. "Alright, so how does that help us?" Ant-Man asked. "It didn't necessarily. Dinah's rescue trop required us to be separate from the action, so Carousel gave us a ship of our own. Kimberly's the penthouse trop guaranteed us desirable lodgings, so we got this alien pleasure vessel instead of some bum cruiser. Bubby's doggy license allowed the use of his dogs in the story even if we had to create clones using an alien device. All of these factors combined created this mishmash, resulting in a clone machine on a cool alien ship, and none of it I assumed had anything to do with the storyline called Itch." "I have no idea," I said. That wasn't quite true. I had a million ideas, but I needed to wait until I found a good one. We didn't want to make the machine do anything. In fact, we weren't even sure it was supposed to be used. The only thing we discovered while messing around with it was that it had profiles for each of Bobby's 5 dogs. The NPC had implied that the dogs were the entire reason the machine was on the ship, so that Bobby could have the dogs that he was licensed to take into the story. Seeing as we didn't need any dogs running around the spaceship, we didn't go anywhere from there. However, as we messed around with it, I started to doubt the cover story that the NPC had given for it as being some Noah's Ark survival machine in case someone was stranded on a planet. The machine was sending instructions to us, and while those instructions were not in English, I never got the impression that it was an emergency device. I had difficulty finding any genetic profiles other than Cassie's and the 5 dogs. If you can't trust a random NPC giving you lore, who could you trust? Her story about the clone machine was just a nonsense cover story in the same way as us being prize winners was a cover story. It wasn't canon. It was just thin logic used like duct tape to graft us onto the storyline. I decided to take a nap inside one of the deep sleep chambers, if only so that I could look through the dailies and see what footage Carousel had collected for me. As usual, my first impression was boredom. Scene after scene showed characters moving from one room to another, showing characters breathing and bedbugs crawling over everything. Oh my god, I hated it. I mentally begged it to stop showing me those damn bugs crawling on sleeping people. Except, of course, it didn't stop because they were literally everywhere, and watching them crawl around was one of the film's primary scare tactics. And they were everywhere. Everywhere. They would crawl through cracks and vents, and if they didn't find a person to latch onto, they would go into hibernation or something, waking up to search again, lay eggs, spread, and cover the ship. Everywhere. Andrew's surrogate had guessed correctly. The bugs were also being spread around by machinery designed to clean things. The fact was, there were too many, and they were too tenacious for the housekeeping robot arms to keep up with. They would hitch rides all over the ship and then go into some strange hibernation phase, waiting for someone to show up. That was good information on how Ibex could be dangerous. Its robotic prostheses were everywhere throughout the ship, built into the modules themselves. I didn't get a look at the full design, just hands here and arms there, but if an audience saw these clips, they would know Ibex had the potential for danger. I wanted to avoid taking the story in that direction. I held out hope for the puzzle version of the storyline that was so much more civilized. After watching the footage, I would ask Ibex about bedbugs because I figured it would have lots of information, and it did. It had an encyclopedic knowledge of most things. Bedbugs could survive for months without feeding. Bedbugs could track you down by carbon dioxide, body heat, and smell. That explained why the 3-player surrogates had been spared. They were underneath some air conditioning unit that prevented the bedbugs from finding them as easily while they were in deep sleep. I had to watch footage of the bedbugs slowly devouring all of the passengers and the medical implements in the deep sleep chambers being so inadequate to combat what was happening. They only seemed to be able to treat the results of what was occurring, and one after another, the machines would blare up, asking for a physical attendant for help. But, of course, since everyone was affected, no one was there to help. The system didn't recognize the threat until everyone was already covered. Strange. Why would it be like that? Ibex seemed smart when I talked to him. Why was he so unable to prevent this fate? One of the cooler things I saw, which had nothing to do with the bedbugs, was the scene where a project manager from Carousel was building the ship. There was no talking, but it was clear what was going on. He was requisitioning assets from another part of the company, using one of the same machines that I had used to look at a 3D model. He was clicking together holographic modules and building a ship. All I could see of him was the top of his head as the camera stared down at the holographic ship he was assembling. I could see numbers on the side where the cost of the build he was designing was going up too high, and he would detach modules that cost too much, like extra life support or extra fuel tankers. In the end, he built the Ibex ship as I recognized it, assembled by someone who was not qualified to do so and for the lowest possible price. How could anything bad happen on that ship? After a long time of watching random footage from around the ship where nothing happened, I finally saw something I had been hoping to see. I saw Bobby. Or should I say, Officer Bobby Gill? He was asleep inside one of the deep sleep chambers, but his chamber was not in the sleeping bay. His was an entirely separate warehouse-sized unit that only seemed to have one sleeping chamber. The camera hovered over the glass of his sleeping chamber, and I could barely make out his face, but I knew it was him. The camera then backed away and moved up over the warehouse so that I could see what was going on around him. And it was horrifying. I saw hundreds of large, multiple refrigerator-sized tanks standing upright at an angle. Each tank had a green glass cover so I could see what was inside. While I expected them to be filled with water, they were not. Instead, they contained animal carcasses. Cows, pigs, chickens, lambs, goats, all kinds of things I could identify just by looking at their bodies. I had to identify them by their bodies because they had no heads. None of them did. Where their neck ended, a bunch of tubes and wires sprouted up into the machine part of their tank. Worse than that, the bodies of these animals were moving. Their limbs were working. Their lungs were inflating and deflating. Of course, without heads, none of them were making sounds. It was a room of silent horror. A separate part of the room was devoted to what looked like algae tanks, but that was less interesting. My mind was so shocked and overcome by what I was seeing that I couldn't even figure out what this room was for. Why did they have a bunch of headless animals hooked up to wires and tubes inside this warehouse? As the camera panned around, I saw that many of the animal bodies were not full size. They were still developing. They were growing these animals from a few cells until they were full grown. And then the camera moved over the title plate for the room, Protein Lab. After reading that, I realized why Bobby was in there. His background Trop made his character a veterinarian, and Carousel put him in charge of the lab-grown meat on the ship. I wasn't sure if these animals were part of the original script or if they were just brought in so that Bobby would have a reason to be a veterinarian. The machines weren't exactly identical in style to the rest of the ship, but they did work with the dark sci-fi aesthetic overall. One thing I did notice was that neither Bobby nor any of the animals seemed to have bed bugs, which lay in direct contradiction to the rest of the ship. If there were any place that should have bed bugs, it would be this one, but it didn't. As if Carousel was listening to my thoughts and wanting to answer my question, the camera angle changed, and I saw that on the door, there was a light that read Biohazard Quarantine. It was really odd that this would be the only room quarantined against bed bugs. But then I realized that wasn't the truth. It was more likely that the room was designed to be cut off from the rest of the ship so that hazardous material from the animals themselves wouldn't get to the passengers. Talk about irony. They tried to protect the people from the cyborg meat puppets and ended up doing the reverse. I noticed that Bobby's chamber had some sort of timer going on. I assumed that meant he would be waking up soon, and we would finally be able to talk to him. After a bit more of watching the headless animals frolic in their brainless dreams, the camera left and showed me other parts of the ship. I tried to memorize them, but the truth was it wasn't that useful of information because I couldn't tell where the cameras were, and the ship was designed in such a nonsensical way that I couldn't make heads or tails of it. That being said, I did get a good look at the helm. And a good look at the control terminal where the pilot should sit. An emergency light was lit. The light read fuel low. Another readout read, the estimated remainder of the fuel is 3 weeks. Coordinate to refuel at the nearest Carousel station. I was willing to bet that Ibex couldn't get out and pump the gas himself. The player surrogates would need to do it. It was a race to the helm through a ship they couldn't traverse without our help. 3 weeks sounded like a long time, except days could pass between scenes in this film. We didn't have that long. I knew that the original story had a ticking time clock. This must have been it. Get to the helm and find a fuel station, or float in space as a human bedbug farm forever. Chapter 31. When I first saw the enemy tropes for this story, I thought it was an escape room, a genre of horror film in which a character pits their wits against obstacles to try and escape to freedom. It was safe to say I was right. First, it was essential to understand how NPCs worked. We watched and studied them as best we could. The surrogates were not normal NPCs who would follow the script and could be persuaded, convinced, or intimidated. These surrogates followed our suggestions. But Andrew, Michael, and Lila embodied the saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. I wanted to jump through the screen and strangle them. Isaac convinced Michael to bang up a sleeping chamber easily because that was something Michael was already inclined to do. Getting them to act against their preset personalities was beyond difficult. "He acts just like the real Andrew," Cassie said. "Isaac, look. He cleans his glasses the same way. He's just like him." On the Ibex, Andrew breathed onto his glasses to form condensation and then wiped them clear. "I'm pretty sure all people with glasses do that," Isaac said. "If he starts talking about Green Day or roller coasters or teacup pigs, then maybe I'll be convinced." The Hughes siblings were on duty watching the surrogates. Not that they needed watching. They weren't going anywhere without our help. I was examining the design of the Ibex, which we had access to through one of the large 3D cubes like the one I had played with near the launch pad. Finding it was not easy. It was in a storage closet with a sci-fi door that only appeared when Rudy, the captain, walked by, but once we had it, we had to learn how to use it. We could only see as much of the ship as the surrogates had unlocked. That was a limitation placed by Carousel because I couldn't see an end-story reason for it. I stared at the hologram for so long that something finally clicked. "I got it," I said. "If we can get them to block off the air intakes in Hallway 3A, that will trigger the system to open up the door into Reservoir B in order to ventilate the ship. Once they're in Reservoir B, they can pass directly into Hallway 3B. Antoine stared at the same diagram I was looking at and nodded his head. "The module design is driving me crazy," he said, staring at the little hologram as I showed him the arrows that explained the airflow system. "These rooms are right next to each other, but they don't share a ventilation system. 3B is connected to the life support system in the back, and 3A is connected to the secondary emergency system in the front. This is absurd." It was. He walked over to the red button that seemed to be a universal talk to the player surrogates button and started to relay my idea off-screen. The player surrogates heard our plan but didn't act on it because they were off-screen, and something like that had to happen on-screen. They wouldn't be on-screen for a bit because, at the moment, the wallflower surrogate Lila had taken too many of the sleeping pills she found, and Dr. Andrew Hughes was trying to keep her alive after having pumped her stomach. This was just one of many things going on with the surrogates. They would follow our suggestions, but they also kept adding drama to the story against our will. "She'll be fine," Dr. Hughes said. "You wouldn't be surprised to find out that one of the few medical events the med bay was prepared for was an overdose." He stood over her and placed the back of his hand on her clammy forehead. "Did she say why she did it?" Michael asked cautiously. "Don't tell me she's—" He trailed off, not wanting to say the words, not wanting to put those words out into the air. "No, nothing like that," Andrew said. "She's been having difficulty getting to sleep now that her deep sleep chamber has stopped responding to her. Insomnia can skew judgment." There was a pause as they both looked down at the pale young woman. "In that case," Michael said, "I could sure use some of those sleeping pills. Every time I close my eyes, I feel bugs all over me. If I could find anything flammable around here, I would set myself on fire." Michael had a morbid sense of humor, I had learned over our time watching him. We had sat and watched them as Lila slowly took one sleeping pill at a time throughout the night in an attempt to get some respite from the bugs. It didn't work. It was possible she didn't realize she was taking too many, even we didn't realize what was happening until Andrew sounded the alarm. They had created a sort of camp in the med bay that they had been able to get to. The solitary benefit of that room was that it had 4 individual beds, which were separated from the ground by a sturdy metal pole. They greased up the metal pole in hopes that the bed bugs would not climb it while they slept. They had not been entirely successful. The scene itself was actually powerful and hefty, with character work and conversations about life and death. It was frustrating for us, though, because this is what they did instead of going out and looking for ways to move forward with the escape. They were not scouting for us. I assumed that was by design. The only way they would move forward was if we helped them. Due to Lila's health problems, they had been on-screen and off-screen and were now getting an off-screen break. Based on what had come before, it was clear that as soon as they came back on-screen, they would try our plan. First, they would have to set it up on film by pretending they came up with it, And then they would have to enact it by blocking off the air vents in an entire hallway. Using an officer to try to trick Bex wasn't working anymore. That was a one-time thing. It would be a pretty dull story if they could use him as some passport to get around the ship. Now, we had to come up with other ways to get through the labyrinth. It was one big puzzle. They went back on screen. You know, I've been thinking about the way the air circulates in this ship, Andrew said. It's all algorithmic. I'm not even sure how much control Bex has over it consciously. What are you saying? Michael asked as he sat up on his high-tech gurney. I think we can trick it into opening the door to the starboard reservoir. We can trick it? Michael repeated. Yes, Andrew said. It's just a matter of making it think that there's an airflow problem. It will automatically fix itself, regardless of what the insane machine wants to think. I thought Bex was designed to fix itself. How long would the trick work? Michael asked. Long enough for us to walk through a door, Andrew said. Michael looked back over his shoulder at the sedated but healing Lila. Tell me what to do, he said. So we watched them as they took rags soaked in some goo that looked almost like vapor cream and started clogging all of the ventilation in hallway 3A. It was the most frustrating wait possible because I didn't even know if my plan would work. Unlike us, they didn't seem to understand they were on a timed clock despite us having told them they were. It just went in one ear and out the other. Their characters didn't know about the fuel situation, or at least they didn't know how dire it was. They never acknowledged us talking to them after the conversation ended, so it made sense that they wouldn't be able to act as if they knew about the fuel problem. There was probably some way to inform them, but we had missed that cutscene. They worked, and they spoke of their old lives and old girlfriends when, eventually, Lila found her way to them and asked what had happened. They were supportive of her, and they had their unit bonding moment with Andrew pledging to keep them all safe until they could one day get home. As he hugged Lila, Michael, being a bit too much over that, just patted her on the back and said, "Hang in there," as if he wasn't sure that the sleeping pills thing was actually an accident. "Oh dear God, please just clog the damn vents." Isaac screamed into the abyss from his seat on the upper decks of the flight platform of our ship. No one argued with him because we all felt the same way. It almost felt like Carousel was teasing us. Watching them was our only entertainment, and it was getting very frustrating. "Wait!" Cassie exclaimed. "Bobby's awake. He just woke up." That was good news. Cassie's anguish trap allowed her to see the statuses of all of our allies, including whether Bobby was conscious. Since he had been asleep for most of the movie, it was about time he woke up. "Bex," I said, "can you please wave Officer Bobby Gill?" Luckily, Bex didn't put up a fight, and we saw the gigantic room filled with animal bodies connected to tubes that I had seen in the dailies. I suppressed a grin as the others got a good look at the horrors. Bobby crawled out of his deep sleep chamber, naked as the day he was born. Literally, no one else had been unclothed in their chambers, but I didn't have time to ask him about that. He was off-screen, so we had the chance to talk to him. "Bobby!" Ant-Man screamed. Bobby's head perked up, unsure of where the sound came from. He looked around the room. He didn't seem surprised to see the monstrosities strapped up in their giant vessels, so he must have either had scenes in this room already or just had memories from his character that made them familiar. He quickly slipped into his space onesie, which all the other passengers were wearing, and continued searching for Ant-Man's voice. "To your left!" Ant-Man screamed. Finally, Bobby found it. It would appear that he didn't actually have a screen showing us. All he had was a little box with a button to communicate with us. "First blood has already passed?" Bobby asked. "Yep," I said. The injured passengers waking up had counted as first blood, luckily. Death wasn't required. He nodded. "My character designed these pods for growing protein in outer space, and Carousel paid me to see if it was a viable program." "We figured something like that," I said. He nodded, still groggy. "What's the big bad?" he asked. "Bedbugs," I said. He nodded slowly, then, in confusion, he said, "Wait, what?" That sure jarred him awake. We spent the next 20 minutes discussing everything that had happened, trying to catch him up to speed. There was a reason Carousel had kept him asleep for so long. His character actually knew a lot about the ship. He was a science officer, like in Star Trek. Unfortunately, he didn't have as much authority with the Bex as other officers did, but at least he had some. "I was thinking it was gonna be aliens," Bobby said. "I could not believe it when they took us up in the ship." "Where are you guys, anyway?" "We're orbiting the Bex in some kind of alien ship from the year 4021 or so," I said. Bobby nodded, taking it in stride. "So what's the plan?" "We're coming up on the halfway mark, aren't we?" "We've got to get you in contact with the player surrogates," I said. "We've currently got them trying to get to hallway 3B, which means they're almost to where you are." Bobby nodded. "I don't know if I'm going to be able to get out of here." They were concerned about the animals spreading disease, despite how I told them that was virtually impossible because all of these animals were grown from embryos inside a lab. He shook his head and rolled his eyes. The project manager knew the term mad cow disease and kept repeating it. "Idiot." Bobby's character had strong feelings about Carousel, apparently. "It's a pretty wild thing," he said as he looked back over the large tanks filled with headless cow bodies moving their legs as if they were on a walk while they hung in their containers. We didn't know if Bobby's character was special to the story. He was a wallflower, and his recast trop, which allowed him to play as background characters, didn't necessarily cast him in important spots. It cast him in places where he could make his character meaningful, although up to now, he mainly ignored his character and joined us as if he were part of the gang, which was probably what he would do in this story as well. "Drifting into space forever doesn't sound very fun," he said. "How far off are we from the helm?" "You're not even halfway there," I said. "You guys are going to have to get a move on. That's the #1 problem we're having. Every time we tell them to do something, they add on like 3 layers of story and character troubles before they do it. The plot cycle is slipping away while they're talking about their childhood dogs." "I'll whip them into shape," he said. "I guess the first thing I should do is call out to them and tell them to come to me if they're already heading in this direction. That should put some pep in their step," Ant-Man said. "They haven't seen another healthy human in weeks." We sat back as Bobby broke off the call with us. We could still watch through the camera. Bex wasn't giving us any trouble over that. After we had figured out how to make a wave to other characters in the story, it was like we had accomplished that, and it was no longer going to be a problem. That was a theme for the storyline. Once you solved something, it remained solved. You couldn't use the same trick twice, but you didn't need to. That was an important factor to note. We watched as Bobby talked to the surrogates through his comm and urged them to find him on the other side of the starboard reservoir. As predicted, they started really booking it, clogging up all the vents in hallway 3A. Bobby switched back over to us with a simple request to Bex, who facilitated the calls. "All right, they're on it," he said. Just talking to Bobby had been a lift to their spirits, and Bobby's slightly awkward demeanor really fit his character here, a disoriented science officer who was more comfortable working with headless animals than with humans. "Where are my dogs?" he asked. "When I first got here, I panicked, and I looked through every tank because I was afraid they would be hanging here." "They are not here," I said. "We have their DNA profile in a cloning machine." It took him a moment to take that in. "Wow," he said with a tone that didn't match the circumstances. "It's like a machine that can clone anything?" he asked. He started laughing. "My character is freaking out on the inside because he's like a mad scientist." He continued to laugh aloud. Bobby didn't just become a random character. He usually became a character that actually existed within the story. Whether the headless cows existed or not, his character was a real scientist, and he had that character's memory and basic personality locked away in his head to use. Wallflowers were extremely overpowered, and their power was only balanced by the fact that they were, well, wallflowers. "As for the plan," I said, "there are 2 main ways to get through. 1. We treat it like a labyrinth of puzzles, which is the most straightforward approach. Getting from room to room is difficult because the Bex isn't cooperating, and you have to trick it into doing what you want. So far, we're doing alright, but we're running out of time, and I'm not exactly sure what the big finishing moment is going to be. What do you mean by that? Bubby asked. Like, there's no fight. Sort of, I said. What's the climax to a story that's literally just an escape room? Either the climax is that you don't escape, and it's a sad ending, or the genre gets bent a little bit and becomes a fight at the end. I don't know if we're prepared for that last part. Bubby nodded. There's not a proper antagonist here, is there? Bex isn't evil. That was the issue. It was possible that Carousel would be okay with the story just being a series of puzzles until the final one is unlocked and everybody goes home happy, but that did not fit with the pattern of other stories. There had to be something coming up, but I didn't know what. So what's the other way you were talking about? Bubby asked. Well, I said, this whole storyline seems to be a very poorly disguised metaphor for how corporatism is bad and workers should stick together. Carousel was perfect for a story about an evil company turning workers against each other. A metaphor story, he said. Aren't those supposed to be hard? Yep. I had explained this all to the rest of our team already, and I wasn't sure if I had done a good job. In most horror movies, the plot is simple, and the scares are what matter. Almost every scene either advances the plot or delivers scares. But there are those movies where the plot is incidental, and the movie is actually about a theme. Movies that come to mind would be The Witch, Get Out, or possibly It Follows. Stories like that were called elevated horror as if they were some new thing, but they've been around for as long as movies have been. It just hasn't been as on the nose. As soon as I realized that this movie cared a lot about its metaphors, I wondered if it was like those others, where getting to the end was more about making a statement than it was about actually solving the plot. Doesn't the Atlas have a section on that? Bubby asked. Kinda, I said. It's not phrased that way, though. They talk about how sometimes you have to play into the themes of a movie. So how do we do that? Bubby asked. I thought for a moment. We get the NPCs to focus on the themes of the story, and we make their escape a metaphor for worker solidarity or something. But it's impossible, I said. If we were the ones running the story, it would be one thing, we could do it, but I don't think we're going to be able to tell the NPCs to do it. They follow our hints, but their backstories and character arcs seem preset. We're just going to have to try to solve the puzzles. I wished I hadn't even mentioned the metaphor thing. It was hard to explain and harder to enact. We were safer just solving puzzles straight up. No layers. No deep meaning. Just puzzles. Clog event. Tricky Bex. Simple. Doable. Explainable. It was the plan. And do you think that'll work? Bubby asked. Just solving the puzzle, ignoring the themes. I didn't answer because I didn't know. I hated this. The section on rescues of the Atlas taught an important lesson. Even though a rescue trope is compatible with a storyline, that doesn't make the storyline it creates beatable, at least not in the way base storylines are. In the same way that ill-fated players once found that rescues could counterintuitively make some storylines more winnable, a rescue could also create a story far more challenging than it was supposed to be. I had to push those thoughts away. We had yet to see a story that wore its themes on its sleeves like this one did. If the idea was that all of the passengers aboard the ship were scabs that are now covered in literal scabs and that they had betrayed their fellow workers by crossing the picket line, then the only way to move forward with that strategy was to either have our NPCs reinforce the themes and be evil if that was what the narrative was implying, or to redeem themselves in some way. If we didn't have complete control over the surrogates, it wasn't an option. It's just something to keep in mind, I said. I really didn't want to have to think about themes and plot. We stood in silence as we watched the NPCs slowly finish clogging events in Hallway 3A, and just as I had predicted, the door to the starboard reservoir opened up with a big whoosh. That was one small step for the surrogates, one giant leap for the needle on the plot cycle. We needed to hurry. Chapter 32 Bex, this is the Helio. Please confirm this transmission. We have no edible provisions on our ship. Mayday, this is an emergency. We are requesting aid on behalf of Carousel, I said. That line required hours of planning, including removing all the food from our ship and throwing it out the airlock. This is the Ibex. I'm confirming with the Helio AI. It seems that you are out of food. That is troubling. My protocols allow me to permit temporary coupling to provide the Helio with an emergency supply of provisions. We all started to cheer aboard the helm of the Helio. It had taken us forever to figure out how to get Ibex to let us connect our ship to theirs so that we could actually go into the Ibex and interact with the story. Everything was a puzzle, even things that weren't happening on screen. It ended up being pretty simple. It was Ramona who figured it out. Ibex would allow us to dock if there were an emergency. It wouldn't acknowledge its own emergency, at least not in so many words. So, Ramona figured, what if the Helio was the ship with the emergency? Ibex had to help us if we were in trouble, and it was able to help. The one thing that we knew for sure was that the Ibex had lots of food. If we needed food, then Ibex should let us attach even if we didn't have the proper approval since we were a fellow Carousel vessel. Exhale. Back to the real problem. We were already halfway through the storyline, and we still had a long way to go to get the player surrogates to the helm of the Ibex. We weren't giving up, but reality was setting in. This wasn't easy. Captain, I said, please connect us to that junction on the starboard side of the Ibex labeled Protein Lab on the hollow frame. You got it, Rudy said. He and the other NPCs had been silently rooting for us. I could see their joy when we finally figured out how to move forward. Now, if only they could have just told us what to do, we'd be on our way home already. This was a big step. We couldn't be a part of the story. In fact, our ship wasn't even in the storyline itself, but if we could get on that ship, we could scout things out ahead and figure out solutions for the NPCs before they even found the problems. This was really convenient because the NPCs were slow and trudging, and they were having the worst days of their lives because of bed bugs. They weren't getting sleep, and they were becoming paranoid. Now, they were lined up outside Bobby's door, trying their best to break through but failing miserably. They desperately wanted in because Bobby told them there were no bugs in there. You're telling me that there is fresh meat on the other side of that door, and yet I can't get this overgrown ATM machine just to open it? Michael said, enraged, at the end of his rope. Michael was also planning to butcher one of Bobby's headless cows. He talked about it a lot after Bobby told him what he did for a living. The protein lab was supposed to be cordoned off from the rest of this ship, Andrew said. It makes sense. Just be patient. Andrew took everything in stride and explored it analytically. I wondered if that was Andrew's real personality or just a generic NPC trait. For now, we celebrated because our ship was connecting to the outside of the large unit that Bobby was currently trapped in. We would get to see Bobby, and most importantly, we would start making some real progress. Within moments, we found ourselves staring at a door in the side of the large room that contained most everything inside our ship. The door was formed from white eggshell material with no seams, yet it easily attached to the outside of the Ibex and created an airtight seal. We waited as the Ibex door unbolted, and with a hiss, the airlock on the outside of the older ship opened. There was Bobby, waiting for us. He had a wide grin on his face, happy not to be alone, happy that we were making progress, and ultimately overjoyed that he was no longer technically stuck on a ship rapidly running out of fuel. As a bonus, behind him were huge tanks filled with decapitated animals, their limbs jogging in thin air to give us emotional support. Let's get to work, Ant-Man said. Except, of course, the only person who needed to get to work was Dinah because she had a trap called Savvy Safecracker, which was based on how movie thieves are so easily able to get through doors and locks. There was a big door between us and the rest of the ship. Stepping into the Ibex was like stepping into another world. We had come from some optimistic future with technology that could aid our every need, and every discomfort was erased before we even knew we hit it. The Ibex was harsh and smelled funny. It didn't smell organic, no, it smelled like we were in a refinery. That smell permeated everything. Dinah was quick to start examining the door that would finally let Bobby out of his room so he could assist the NPCs on the other side, who were currently occupied talking about their feelings or something. Dinah ran her hands along the metal, which had been painted yellow in an industrial style. "It'll take a couple of hours," she said, "but I can do it." "How?" Bobby asked. "I have no idea," she answered as she got to work looking for tools or something around Bobby's workspace. That's how her power worked. She just had to look busy and focused, and then the answer would come to her. We left Isaac, Cassie, and Ramona aboard the Helio. They couldn't do much over here, and the last thing we needed was for them to get trapped off-screen and unable to get back to our ship. Even standing on the Ibex made me nervous, but it was rapidly becoming necessary as coaching surrogates around the vessel from cameras was not going to cut it. Dinah's estimate was correct. She banged on the door with various implements for a while until it suddenly dawned on her what she needed to do. "All right, what we do is wire power directly into the mechanism that unlocks the door," she said. "These doors are designed to be locked by default, and they need power in order to unlock. It makes sense because, technically, this door could have been on the outside of the ship had Bobby's unit not been attached. You want the default to be locked. Right now, we've got these huge tungsten rods acting as pins, and we're not going to move them or cut through them, and we all know how Ibex is." She usually used her trap to stick a bobby pin into a door lock and move it around until it clicked, but it was cool to see that it would work on something a bit more advanced. Before long, she and Bobby, who had suddenly become quite handy with technology because of his character's background, had hooked up wires into the door and then connected those to some pump that Bobby's character used on the giant animal tanks. All Bobby had to do was turn on the pump to supply power to the locks and bypass Ibex, and the door unlocked. Maybe Ibex universe didn't have space piracy because that seemed like a glaring security failure. Unfortunately, we were in the world's most high-stakes game of telephone, so the complications weren't over. Even though we had unlocked the door, we were not technically in the storyline, so we had to get out of the camera shot so that Bobby could do it all again on his own for the audience. Deep breaths. That was easy enough. We just went and hid in the giant warehouse with its endless rows of headless cattle. Carousel seemed to understand what was going on because Bobby went on screen as soon as he started trying to unlock the door. He called out to the NPCs on the other side, telling them what he was doing. "You're gonna electrocute yourself," Micah yelled through the intercom. "Oh, I've done that plenty of times," Bobby said. "It's not that big a deal." With a little bit of rigging, moving wires around, and recreating the actions that Dinah had shown him, he got the door to unlock again, and he looked like a genius doing it. I was hoping that a higher-ranked officer would come along and let me out. "But a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do," Bobby said. With the pull of a handle, the large circular door swung ajar, and for the first time, we got to see the NPCs that we had been shepherding face to face. Well, technically, we were hiding in the back of the room, but seeing them physically was quite horrifying because even though they had never been as infested with bedbugs as terribly as the other passengers, they were still eaten up. They had weeping wounds and scratches from where they had itched themselves in their sleep. But that wasn't the only thing notable about what came through that door when they walked in. They brought an aura with them. I could feel it. I could feel paranoia and anxiety. I could feel the effects of the bedbugs converted into a dark form of movie magic designed to ensure that anyone in this movie played their part. I scratched the back of my neck, and as I looked around at Antoine, Kimberly, and Dinah, I saw that I was not the only one. To his credit, Bobby was doing great. His character was technically a science officer, so he was able to order Ibex to open the next couple of doors. That was a great relief to the NPC's anus. After that, it was a no-go. "You have exceeded your permissible access coordinates," Ibex said as if those words made sense next to each other. Bobby was also very reassuring. Since he had not spent his entire waking hours scratching himself, he was a voice of calm to them that even the analytical android could not match. However, we were facing a problem. Second blood was coming up soon. We only had one, 2, maybe 3 scenes before it appeared. First blood had been pretty bloodless, with the exception of the blood of the passengers, who all woke up screaming. No one had to die other than those who had already passed from allergies or infection. But second blood promised that someone or lots of someones had to go. We only hoped it would be more passengers and not our surrogates. We knew that there was another sleeping bay attached to the ship, a much smaller one that had all the same problems as the larger one. Everyone was infected with bed bugs and being kept sedated. If we could get the player surrogates there, we reasoned that second blood could involve some shocking scene from the second sleeping bay, and our little sheep, Andrew, Lila, and Michael, might be okay. It was gruesome, but that was the best case scenario. Our priority among the surrogates was rescuing Andrew, though we didn't want to lose any of them. Obviously, we didn't want to lose Bobby. We could not let that happen. We also had an unanswered question: was it possible for my friends and I who were not a part of the storyline to die? Would Carousel try to do that? All of my reading from the Atlas had led me to believe that it wouldn't. Carousel wouldn't protect us if we put ourselves in danger, but because we were not really characters, it wouldn't go out of its way to kill us. And we could tell ourselves that over and over again, but that did not remove the fear. On to the next obstacle. This one was relatively straightforward. Bobby was not qualified to unlock the door to something called the Carousel, which was designed to allow people to walk across the large mechanism where the anti-gravity machine was kept. This was a significant problem because this one hallway divided the entire Ibex into 2 parts. There was no other way across, not a way designed for passengers, at least. Even from the video footage, Dinah could tell that it was not a door she could unlock, which meant it must have been scripted. We weren't supposed to pass through the safe hallway. We had to find another way forward. The only way for them to pass by this section of the ship to get to the helm was by crossing something called a phase ballast, which was in the heart of the anti-gravity mechanism. When we asked Ibex what a phase ballast was, he gave us this answer: "Ah, yes, the phase ballast. In layman's terms, the phase ballast is a critical component of the ship's gravimetric stabilization matrix. It's essentially a hyperdynamic oscillatory beam that functions within the quantum flux array, suspended in a state of controlled magneto-inertial flux. This beam operates within a subspace envelope, where it modulates the gravitational phase variance in real time, ensuring that the ship's anti-gravitational field maintains a stable equilibrium across all sectors. As you might assume, the phase ballast achieves this by oscillating at a frequency that harmonizes with the ship's phase modulation grid, thereby synchronizing the gravitational waveforms with the inertial compensators. This process mitigates the effects of external gravitational anomalies, which could otherwise destabilize the ship's trajectory or cause localized gravitational distortions. In even simpler terms, the phase ballast is like the conductor of an orchestra, but instead of music, it's orchestrating the very forces of gravity itself. The magnetic suspension of the ballast within the gravitational zone allows it to float freely, optimizing its phase variance correction without the interference of conventional gravitational forces. It's quite fascinating, really, a delicate dance of graviton particles and quantum fields, all governed by the elegant mathematics of hyperdimensional physics. If you would like a more technical explanation, feel free to ask. That was very enlightening. I didn't know if Carousel had a mouth, but I swore I could hear it laughing. Chapter 33. I'll test it out, Ant-Man said. We had left Bobby's room and had gone up ahead of the NPCs to scout and see if there was anything tricky about the phase ballast. I didn't know if Ibex would have a problem with us walking through its halls, but it didn't seem to. All of our tropes designed to help us with stealth seemed wasted. We weren't part of the movie. We were just around. When we reached the part of the ship where everything bottlenecked and a giant locked door prevented us from using the Carousel, we found a human-sized ventilation shaft that would allow a person to enter the phase ballast matrix. I could get that thing off of there, Ant-Man said, staring at the cover of the ventilation shaft. At first, it appeared to be an obstacle in and of itself. Yes, but then it wouldn't make sense why the ventilation shaft was already broken open, I said. The solution was far more straightforward. We had brought a screwdriver from Bobby's workshop. It wasn't difficult to get into the ventilation shaft. In movies, it never is. "Here goes nothing," Ant-Man said. He was eager to help. So far, all we had done was guide people around and come up with ideas. He didn't feel like he was really contributing as much as he could. But testing out a potentially suicidal jungle gym, he felt that he could do that. He dropped down into the room, and I followed right after him. It definitely was an obstacle out of a sci-fi movie. The phase ballast was basically a giant boardwalk about the length of a basketball court that connected two platforms on the ends of a large tube, which was the room we were in. I couldn't see the walls because everything was dark, but there were sci-fi lights attached to the platform and ambient light that allowed us to see in front of us. As far as I could see, the ballast itself did not touch either of the platforms or connect to anything else. It was floating free. Therein lay the challenge. As soon as Ant-Man stepped foot onto the phase ballast, it started to move, and he was instantly down on all fours, finding handholds where the lights emanated from or where wires stuck out. It wasn't explicitly designed to be climbed on, but there was plenty to grab onto. The thing moved, tilted, and spun around with him right on it, but ultimately, he held on. It was just a test of strength and dexterity. For some reason, it reminded me of a rodeo, as the ballast moved and turned and bucked but ultimately submitted once Ant-Man had shown he was not giving up easily. Ant-Man made it to the other side with a sheen of sweat on his forehead, and then he waved me forward. "No, I'm good," I said. "Time to come back, we need to instruct the NPCs." He rolled his eyes. "What? Coward!" he yelled. I wasn't afraid to cross the ballast. I was concerned about time. Second Blood would be here soon, and I wanted the NPCs to be far past this room when it got here. I was also a little afraid to cross the ballast. Once we got Bobby alone, we explained everything that we saw to him. Of course, his character had every reason to understand how the ship worked, so he explained it to the NPCs quickly. Everything was going according to plan. Until it wasn't. As the NPCs approached the phase ballast, we watched from the shadows, itching ourselves but excited. Getting past this obstacle was a colossal checkpoint, the helm was only a few more puzzles away. "Remind me of why we didn't try to exterminate the bedbugs again?" Ant-Man asked. "I'm going crazy, and I haven't even been bitten yet." "Crystal," I said. "Crystal?" Ant-Man asked. "The harem sorcerer." "That one," I said. Grace and Chris said that his high level was enough to know that he wasn't to be messed with. Enemies that are way too high level are a distraction, not meant to be beaten. They are a red herring, a time waster. The bedbugs are deeply ingrained. Yeah, there are all sorts of things we could do about them. Heck, Andrew spent a day and a half trying to keep them away from some of the officers. It didn't work. It won't work. I know so. I've seen their tropes. But all I needed to see was the plot armor. That's part of the secret language of the game. I get it, Ant-Man said. We still could have tried. Let's try that after we win, I said. We can come back here and set them all on fire. I didn't say I wanted to come back, Ant-Man said. This is one story I don't care to master. We turned and watched the surrogates as they finished their dialogue setting up the phase ballast. Bobby's technobabble was far less elaborate than Ebek's. "We crossed the giant metal beam that controls gravity," he said. "It won't be easy, but we can do it." The surrogates peppered him with tech questions, many of which he seemed to answer gracefully because his character was well informed. Others, he just floundered. "It's best not to think about the specifics," he said. "Just get to the other end." And so they prepared themselves. Michael told a story about basic training and how his drills in anti-gravity were probably similar to the interior of the artificial gravity machine. Basic surrogate filler material. Just as they were about to climb into the phase ballast, a scream sounded from toward the back of the ship. Then another. Then another. "They are waking back up," Andrew said. "We have to go sedate them again. They won't survive off life support. God damn it, I'm going to make sure that everyone knows what they did to us here." He and Michael immediately ran back toward the sleeping bay against Bobby's protests. Lila instead ducked her head down into the phase ballast matrix to take a look, and then she sat waiting. She wanted no part in the screaming passengers. Her ivory skin covered in blood as she sat in the industrial ship's hallway was an image that could have been on the movie poster, the blank look in her eyes as if the lights had gone out. The issue was that resedating all of the passengers took time, not just actual time but screen time, moving the story forward. "Bobby, get them back here and get them across this phase ballast now," I said, but we both knew my words were wasted. We had set in motion everything that would happen, and it was too late to change it. Second blood was upon us. Antoine, Kimberly, Dinah, and I couldn't risk being on the ship during second blood, so we found ourselves running back to the Helio. We actually crossed paths with the surrogates, but they didn't make eye contact or acknowledge us. They weren't on screen at the moment, but they would be soon. They were headed back up toward the phase ballast. I had a feeling that grabbing them and absconding with them to safety would displease Carousel. I was looking down a long hallway, watching them run toward it. At the end of it, I saw Bobby poking his head back, wondering if he, too, should be seeking shelter somewhere else. It didn't make sense for his character not to be in this scene, but I could not risk Bobby dying. Bobby had less plot armor than the NPCs, 24 to their 25. I couldn't risk him being there. I couldn't risk him being on screen during second blood, even if it hurt the final film. I could tell he was nervous about it, too. I waved for him to come back to us, and he did. As he passed the NPCs in the hall, he begged them not to go forward with their plan, but his words were wasted. He then gave them some excuse about why he wasn't going to be there, and then all of us ran into his warehouse-sized unit and boarded the Helio. We closed the door behind us but did not disconnect the ship. Bobby couldn't die for second blood if he was on the Helio because the Helio didn't exist in the movie. He looked around with amazement as we walked up to the helm of our ship, where the viewing monitors were, so we could see what the NPCs were doing. "Sure would be easy if we could just tell the player surrogates to come over here, huh?" Isaac said as he saw us coming. "No kidding." We watched as the 3-player surrogates lowered themselves down into the room with the phase ballast. "I'll go first," Andrew said. "You keep her safe." Michael nodded. Andrew crawled out onto the phase ballast, not taking any chances, not trying to be too brave. He hugged tight to the surface, not moving forward unless he hit something to hold on to. Gravity might have been on his side at that moment, but he seemed to understand what this machine did, so when it first started to jerk and turn, he was not taken by surprise. His crossing was more dramatic than Antoine's because it was on screen. There were staged pauses as the phase ballast shook and twisted and then came to balance again, and Andrew put one hand over another, finding a grip and crawling forward, the length of a football field. Eventually, he reached the other side and made it onto the platform. He stood up and gave the other side a thumbs up. Next up was Lila. She moved slowly, afraid of every tremor. She made one movement after another until she reached the center of the phase ballast, and suddenly, there was turbulence. She screamed, and Michael called out, "Lila!" She was frozen with fear. "Come on, Lila. You have to crawl the rest of the way. You'll be fine. Just make sure you have a handhold," Andrew said. "I'm afraid," she said, crying. True to her word, she didn't move. And because she didn't move, Carousel got cranky. The whole platform turned over 180 degrees, and she was left hanging from handholds and screaming at the top of her lungs. "I'm coming." Michael called out to her. "Just hold on a little bit longer." This was an entirely different task. Walking on top of the phase ballast was hard enough, but trying to monkey bar along the bottom with the feeble handholds available was something else. The underside of the phase ballast, which was now on top, did not have the friendly handholds that the top did. He looked it over but wasn't willing to risk trying to walk to her without anything to hold on to. He quickly found himself with one leg wrapped around the side of the ballast and both of his hands gripping onto handholds on the underside where Lila was. He pulled himself along, sticking to the side of the platform, showing off the strength that he had gained in the military. It was incredible to watch, a feat of strength and coordination. And just as he was almost to Lila, within arm's reach where he could reach out and almost get to her, the platform flipped back over. Lila was able to hang on, and she was now back on top of the platform, but Michael was not so lucky. He had one hand on a meager handhold, but the entire rest of his body was pulled out sideways as if gravity wasn't behaving. The extreme forces of the phase ballast were pulling him as the entire platform began to shake and rotate. Lila managed to grab hold with her hands and move her feet up under two wedges, which allowed her to establish a good foundation and hang on. "Grab my hand!" Michael screamed. "Grab onto it. I'm slipping." He reached out toward Lila. She refused to look at him. "Lila!" he screamed. "Give me your hand." But she just froze, shook, and looked in the other direction, either too afraid to understand what was going on or too scared to let loose of one of her secure handholds and risk being pulled off the platform with Michael. "Grab him!" Andrew screamed. "He's right there, just grab him. Pull him out of that gravitational pocket. Hurry!" But Lila did nothing. Moments later, the platform started to gyrate back and forth. Michael was beaten up against the side of the wall, first with a scream and then with a crunch. And it went on for a while as Carousel got its footage of the carnage. It was like he was inside of a clothes dryer. Even with our poor vantage point from the security camera in the room, we could see that there were parts of him, mostly blood, floating in the anti-gravity field around the platform. And with that, second blood passed. The rescue poster for Michael Brooks disappeared from the red wallpaper, leaving me thinking of the million ways I might have prevented it. Tobe continued. Thanks for listening.